problem. I would like to introduce
Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Investigations Team.
Welcome to another edition of Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Radio. Today's show, we're going to have Stanton Friedman back on the line as our guest. And before we give Stanton a call, I'm going to try to get a hold of one of our co-hosts really quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trying to get a hold of him right now.
I'll answer this, yeah.
Nick? Hello. It says he's on. Oh, never mind. It says he answered and hung up or something. But anyways, should I just call Stanton?
I just want to give Brent a call first, too.
Yeah, I'll give Brent a call.
Yeah, just so we have plenty of people. I know Jimmy has forgot.
Yeah, one sec. I just have to find it real quick. Yeah, sorry about this, everybody. Just having a little bit of difficulties.
Communication area.
All right, let's see if he'll answer. But well, I'm going to give Stanton a call, I guess.
Okay.
All right, let's see. All right, so
good evening.
oh, hey, Stanton. It's This is Jeremy from the Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Radio Show, and I have one of my co-hosts on the line.
Good. Who's that?
Stanton.
Hi. Who are you?
Hi. Well, we're going to have a good show for this hour. We already have a bunch of questions coming in. First, I was going to say, is there any way you could say a little bit about yourself for those of our listeners that don't know who you are or don't keep up with your research?
Sure. Now? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Stanton Friedman. My website is www.stantonfriedman.com. I was trained as a nuclear physicist, spent 14 years in industry working on a wide variety of very advanced, highly exciting, eventually canceled nuclear research and development programs. My specialty was canceled government programs. Nuclear airplanes, fission rockets, fusion rockets, nuclear power plants for space, big companies, GE, Westinghouse, General Motors, TRW Systems, Aerojet, General, McDonnell Douglas. Couldn't hold a job, obviously. Got interested in flying saucers in 1958, working as a young nuclear physicist for GE on the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department, which most people have never heard of. That year, we only spent $100 million. I was 58 and employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. So it wasn't 6 professors and 12 grad students. It was big time. But it was canceled. It was exciting while it worked. Anyway, I got interested in flying saucers just by reading a book, Edward Ruppelt's book in 1958. The only reason I ordered it was marked down from $2.95 to $1, which would have been tipping on for the rest of the books. I read a whole bunch of books, some of which were trash, and finally I found at the University of California, Berkeley Library, something that hadn't been mentioned in any of the books that I'd read, the final Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. Biggest study ever done for the U.S. Air Force. The work was done by Battelle Memorial Institute, although their name isn't in the report. And what shocked me was, A, it hadn't been mentioned in all the books that I had read. B, it had so much data, more than 250 charts, tables, graphs, maps. I was in data heaven. And C, in the press release that the Air Force put out, the Secretary of the Air Force lied through his teeth about the study. This was in October 1955. They'd done some lies before that, but especially then and since then. He said, on the basis of this report, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational information had been available. That sounds very straightforward, but I had the report, and he was lying. The unknowns weren't 3%, they were 21.5%. That's not a round-off error, in other words. And they were completely separate from the 9.3% for which there was insufficient information. And the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unidentifiable. And the guys who did this study asked an obvious question. Is there really any difference between the unknowns and the knowns? Maybe we just missed the boat in the screening process, although they had a rule, no sighting could be listed as an unknown unless all 4 of the final report evaluators agreed it was an unknown. They looked at 3,201 cases, so we're not talking about just a few reports. They found the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. They found the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. And yet, my University of Chicago classmate for 3 years, Carl Sagan, has said that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable, and there are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings, which is baloney. Just the opposite. The more reliable, the more likely to be unidentifiable. So that got me mad. I don't like being lied to. And I joined a couple of UFO groups, NICAP and APRO, long gone, to get their newsletters, and talked to my colleagues at work, at, brown bag lunches, that sort of thing. And finally gave my first media appearance, if you will, in 1967. I had talked to Frank Edwards, whom I'd gotten to know when I worked in Indianapolis for General Motors, one of my many canceled jobs. And he was active on the board of NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and he had written a book, Flying Saucers Serious Business, sent me a copy, and I called him and I said, Frank, you know everybody, give me some names. I want to make noises. So he gave me several names. I was working in Pittsburgh for Westinghouse Astronuclear by this time on nuclear rockets. I just love the name of the program. He gave me the name of the producer for a program called Contact. I was like, oh, he does. And I called the show, and I was surprised that, working in Pittsburgh as a nuclear physicist for Westinghouse are, gold-plated credentials, you know what I mean? You want to borrow money for a house? How big a house you want to buy,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I called the Contact, and the guy basically said, no, don't call us, we'll call you. Less than a month later, he called me, but only because somebody had canceled at the last minute. He called me at 6:30 to do a 7 o'clock talk show, and I lived, only because I think I lived near the station. And I wonder how many people, never did find out how many people he called before he called me. Anyway, I did the show. I wasn't as good as dealing with noisy negativists then as I am now. And somebody at work at Westinghouse heard me, and her reading group, her book review club, was reading Frank's book. How about giving a lecture to her group in her living room? Sure, why not? I did. And I liked it, and they liked it, and I did that show again. I did a whole bunch more freebies. And then I got lucky, I guess. One of 2 days, this is all serendipity. I did not set out to be the flying saucer physicist from Fredericton, where I live, Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. One of 2 days that I drove to work from downtown Pittsburgh, Westinghouse was where I worked, was out of town in a small town called Large, believe it or not. And I'm riding with Joanne, who had a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Tech University at that time. And I'm saying, gee, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Tech. She says, well, why don't you talk to the dean? I said, well, I talked to Dr. So-and-so, and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Give him a call. Well, with that kind of recommendation, so I gave him a call. And sure, he'd love to have me. And we talked about a date, and finally it turned out he wanted a daytime talk. And the last question was, how much do you want? And I knew I'd have to take at least half a day off work. So I said, $100, figuring he'd cut me down to $50, but what the heck. Sold, because I knew his wife. And then he told me what he was paying the other people in the series, you understand. $1,500, $1,700, $1,600. But it was worth it because I had a very good response to the lecture and big crowd and all that sort of thing. He wrote a nice letter to the agent through whom he had booked the other speakers. And the agent booked me for the Engineering Society of Detroit for $300 and expenses, which sounded like a lot of money. And it turned out they were sold out 3 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. And there wasn't one negative question. I mean, of course, these were my people. I'd been working with engineers for a lot of years by that time. But that was great encouragement. And so I went to my boss and I said, I need some advice. Look, I've got a mortgage, I got a wife, I got a kid, I got a security clearance, I got a good job. I don't want to lose any of these things. So I need to know the company attitude. I want to do more lectures, but I don't want to break any rules. They came back to me, 3 rules. First, you can say what you please on your time. Second, you can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. Third, we would like you to start with, what do I call it, an indemnity or, something like the views you're about to hear, a disclaimer, I guess would be a better word. The views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and not those of my employer. Now, what else could you ask for? That's great. I mean, I hear guys at universities, don't tell anybody I'm interested because I'd lose tenure or something. Well, I did ask for something more. I got a call from a colleague of mine also working on nuclear rockets, radiation shielding at Los Alamos National Lab. Stan, how about speaking to the local section of the American Nuclear Society? He'd heard about me speaking around. Well, sure, I'd love to. No, I mean on an expense account. I don't make those decisions. Let me ask management. Because I was in Pittsburgh, he was in New Mexico. It was going to cost some money to get me there, And they said, sure. So I was on an expense account to go to Los Alamos to give a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real, to the Los Alamos section of the American Nuclear Society. And in other words, I didn't have to hide behind a technical discussions trip to Los Alamos. And there were over 500 people at the lecture. Again, no negative questions. And I mention all of this because I don't want people to think that I was speaking to a bunch of kooky UFO people or far out nuts or whatever. Very solid people. And I did a lot of talks to sections of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Institute of Electrical Electronic Engineers, management clubs for people like Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas and North American Aviation, stuff like that. It was the enthusiastic response of these, my professional colleagues, if you will, that encouraged me to go on. And when the bottom fell out of the advanced nuclear and space systems business in about 1970, I went full time. And I'm still doing it. I've only given about 700 lectures in all 50 states, all 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries. Done hundreds of radio and television programs, written 5 books, or co-written, do a monthly column for the MUFON Journal. So I've been heavy into ufology. I figure I've answered 50,000 questions along the way. I'm lucky. My strengths were ones that are appropriate to being, quote, an expert, whatever that means, on this subject. I worked on far-out propulsion systems. One of the biggest arguments from the nasty, noisy negativists is, you can't get here from there, Friedman. Don't you understand that? No, I don't understand that, because I worked on fission nuclear rocket. People may not be aware that Los Alamos, for example, Los Alamos, Aerojet General, and Westinghouse, all 3 built nuclear rocket systems. The Los Alamos one was the biggest one, less than 8 feet in diameter, power level 4,400 megawatts. That's twice Grand Coulee Dam. Less than 8 feet in diameter. Wow. Very impressive. The program was canceled, of course, but that's beside the point. I also worked on a fusion propulsion system, a study of that. And if you use the right stuff in the right way, you can kick particles out the back end of a nuclear fusion rocket that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. Not 10 million times. So most people don't know about these things, is what I'm saying. Especially the ancient academics and fossilized physicists who tell you there is no evidence and you can't get here from there, and governments can't keep secrets. I worked under security for 14 years. I've been to 20 archives, looked at God knows how many documents. Governments can keep secrets. Used to get a lot of laughs when I'd show a blacked out CIA UFO document. You know, you could read 8 words on a page, or the whited out NSA document, National Security Agency, where you can read 1 sentence on the page, everything else is whited out. Sources and methods. Sure, 98% is sources and methods, and the rest is UFOs. That makes no sense. Also, I had an experience when I was in 5th grade that set the tone for the rest of my life. Miss Rose Gutkin told our class that the sun stands still and the planets move around the sun. And I had just read an article in our cheap encyclopedia that the whole solar system, the sun and the planets, was moving around the center of the galaxy at 12 miles a second. Boy, that seemed fast to me. So I piped up, and she got angry at me. No, that's not the way it is. I got it right here. Well, I didn't sass her back because I was an A student. I didn't sass teachers. But the next day I brought in the encyclopedia, and she read it and rather reluctantly agreed that, well, maybe that's the way it is. But the lesson it taught me has stayed with me the rest of my life. If you're going to take on authority figures, have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. I was in high school debating, same idea. Have your facts in hand. Never lie. And you should know both sides of the argument. Any lawyer will tell you the same thing. So I've been lucky, play to my strength. I enjoy being on the stage. I'm a true Leo. I share my birthday, July 29th, with Peter Jennings, who did that mockumentary about UFOs on February 24th, 2005, and who also is a Canadian and an American. I'm a dual citizen, so I was disappointed in him. And Benito Mussolini also has a birthday on July 29th. He was a great public speaker now. So what I'm saying is I've had a ball. I've lectured all over, and I thought I'd not be doing much. I mean, I'm an old guy, and this past year, however, I spoke in Saudi Arabia, would you believe? In Poland, the Polish UFO Society brought me in to give a lecture. I spoke in Brazil, just outside Sao Paulo. I spoke in Newfoundland, 3 trips down to New Hampshire, and then there were lectures in Arizona, California, New Mexico, Georgia, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. I'm keeping busy. And also, there's one other thing going on I got to brag about. Today I signed a contract with a studio, a stellar organization in California, Bryce Zabel, who did Dark Skies. They have taken an option on 2 of my books. One is Top Secret Magic about MJ-12, to make a movie, this is, and my life story. And for the same movie, they also have an option on Don Schmidt's book, Witness to Roswell, with Tom Carey. And I'm going to make a dynamic film, sort of like All the President's Men, the difficulty of dealing with such controversial subjects. And I want Richard Dreyfuss to play me, but who knows? And then today, literally, I signed a contract, Kathleen Marden and I did, for the movie rights, same outfit, to capture the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And Kathleen is Betty's niece, has all the original hypnosis tapes and all the correspondence and all the rest of that. She's the trustee of Betty's estate. And we wrote the book, captured. She did most of the work. Let's face it, she had the material. I was hit the nasty, noisy, negativist guys and talk about the star map and stuff like that. But so there is a chance there might be 1, even 2 movies based on books that I was connected with. That's exciting. I hate to admit this, but with my name on 5 books, but more people watch movies than read books, it seems. What a shame.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting, though, like you said. That's pretty neat.
Well, it is exciting, and Bryce is very knowledgeable. Some people may remember Dark Skies. There was cover-up there and stuff like that. But he was an officer in the big union in Hollywood, producers and directors and stuff, and has worked with Spielberg and other people like that. Donnie Most is involved with them too. If you remember Ralph from what was the movie? What was the television show? Ron Howard and Don Most, Happy Days.
Oh,
remember that?
Yeah,
well,
sure. Yeah, I wasn't watching, but we watched the reruns.
Well, you're probably right, but so there is excitement, there is interest. I have lectured in all the states and all the provinces and 18 other countries. I've mentioned that not to brag, but because it proves that people are interested. I get people saying, how come there haven't been any sightings recently? MUFON last month had over 600 reports, over 700 the month before that. Mutual UFO Network. There have been reports. Just you don't hear about them, that's another story. But and times have changed a lot. When I was growing up, we didn't know there were any other planets outside our solar system. We didn't know when I was young about fission or fusion. And, one of the crazy things, I get irked at the ancient academics and fossilized physicists who think the only place research gets done is in academia. And I've had people tell me, I'm the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. I've had people say, well, Stan, if that had really happened, then they would have had to pull scientists from half the colleges in the country. And I say, you got to be kidding. I take it you're not aware of the huge high-tech organizations that existed outside of academia. Los Alamos, I mentioned, Sandia Corporation, Livermore, 3 nuclear weapons labs. I checked about 10 years ago. They each employed more than 8,000 people. Each had an annual budget of more than $1 billion. Wow. A lot of money. And when I was working on nuclear airplanes, we spent $100 million in 1958. Employed 3,500 people, 1,100 of them engineers and scientists. The $100 million was a lot of money in 1958.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, definitely.
You know, it wasn't 8 professors and 20 grad students. And no, they didn't publish in scientific journals. The work was classified. But I gave papers at classified radiation shielding meetings. Great fun. So what I'm saying is, if you want high-tech work done, you don't go to a university. You go to a national laboratory or to industry. Stealth fighters, Lockheed, $10 billion over 10 years. That's a pretty good sum of money. You know, a lot of technical people. So the real world is different, and I've been surprised at how few people know. They've heard of nuclear submarines. There are a couple hundred of them around the world, but what they don't know is that there are also nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can operate for 18 years without refueling.
Dang.
Wow.
I'm impressed by that, you know, and I worked on nuclear fusion, and if there's one thing you can be sure of, any advanced civilization is going to find out about nuclear fusion for a simple reason. That's what makes the stars work. We figured it out in 1938. We did something about it in 1952. We built our first H-bomb. And, you know, we're real good when it comes to killing people. First figured it out in 1938. A big bomb in World War II was a 10-ton blockbuster, 10 tons of TNT, equivalent energy release. Make a pretty good hole in the ground, incidentally. In 1945, our first A-bomb, nuclear fission, released the energy of 19,000 tons of TNT. And 7 years after that, only 7 years later, we exploded our first H-bomb, our first fusion device, 10 million tons of TNT equivalent. The fireball was 3 miles wide, incidentally. I've often wondered what the aliens thought when they saw that. What are these idiots doing, you know? So, you know, in a 10-year period, you go from 10 tons to 19,000 to 10 million tons of TNT equivalent. And the Russians exploded one a few years later, 57 million tons of TNT energy release. Now, I mention that only because you can use that for propulsion, just as you can make a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And so, if you use the right stuff in the right way, you can kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. 10 million times.
Wow.
And, you know, I'm trying to impress people simply because if you're going to say you can't get here from there, well, if we ignore all we know that would lead us to how to get there, you know. And the thing is, we have no reason to believe we're the most advanced society around. I mean, I know that's going to come as a shock to your listeners, but well, here's the kicker. The Earth has been around for more than 4 billion years. There are stars that are a lot older than that. And my favorite pair of stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, that's the constellation of Reticulum, which means the net in Latin. Zeta is the Greek letter. Now, these two stars, we dug into them and so forth because of the Betty and Barney Hill case. Our book, Kathleen Martin did most of the work, captured the one I was talking about for movie purposes. Those two stars, as it turns out, are the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our local neighborhood. They're only an eighth of a light year apart from each other, so they're 30 times closer than the sun is to the next star over. We're out in the boondocks. I don't mean Fredericton, New Brunswick, where I live, either. I'm talking about solar system, you know. Now, beyond that, they're only 39.3 light years from us, which is just down the street. And they are a cool billion years older than the sun. From a planet around one of them, you can directly observe the other star all day long. And you could easily determine whether there are planets and whether there is biological life on the surface of those planets. There'd be a heck of a lot more incentive to develop interstellar travel when you got a neighbor an eighth of a light year away than in our situation. and you got an extra billion years to do it in. So anybody who thinks we're at the top of the heap is about as silly as before Copernicus when they were saying the Earth is the center of the universe. You know, Copernicus came along, Nicolaus Copernicus, a good Polish astronomer. 1543, his book came out. He died the same year, so he didn't get burned at the stake. Giordano Bruno did in 1600. But Copernicus had the gall to say the Earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is, and all the planetary bodies go around the sun. His book was banned by the church for 300 years. Now we are beginning to recognize, hey, you know what? The sun isn't the center of the universe either. It's not the oldest star around. There is no reason to say there's anything special about this place. That bothers some people. As a matter of fact, back about 1960, the Brookings Institute, a think tank, did a study on the impact of contact with extraterrestrials on our society. They noted that one of the groups that would be impacted the most would be the engineers and scientists who would suddenly realize they're not at the top of the heap. And I think they're right. Those guys don't even want to look at the data. What's his name? Dr. Tyson, head of the Hayden Planetarium. On the Peter Jennings mockumentary that I mentioned earlier, he pointed out that our fastest craft is the Voyager spacecraft, and it would take 70,000 years to get to the nearest star. And scientists don't want to wait that long to get their data for their experiments. Ha, ha, ha. He didn't bother to mention it hasn't had a propulsion system on it since it left the Earth. You know, throwing a bottle in the ocean is not a good way to find out how long it takes to cross the ocean. Of course, he also said at Penn State University, when it came to the question of secrecy, that, look, we know governments can't keep secrets. The proof of that is look how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. Think about that for a minute. What's that got to do with keeping secrets? Nothing. But it's a very clever line. And Dr. Seth Shostak, SETI Institute, you know my definition for SETI is silly effort to investigate, S-E-T-I, rather than search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And Seth said, oh, government can't keep secrets. Look at FEMA and the hurricane that caused so much trouble. We didn't manage that very well at all. Katrina. Look at the post office. They don't run the post office very well. I didn't hear him talk about the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Office of Scientific Investigation, the NSA, the CIA, the DIA, there's a whole bunch of NRO, great one of the alphabet soup agencies. So people are, you know, wearing blinders. They don't want flying saucers to be treated. If aliens are visiting, who needs to listen with a radio telescope? You know, learn sign language might help.
Well, I have something interesting I was going to bring up to you.
Okay.
I know you do a lot of interviews, but something I thought you remember us by is we were the guys that were doing the Ely, Nevada UFO crash. I don't know if you remember.
The what? Which Nevada? What did you say?
E-L-Y, Ely.
Oh, I always thought it was Eli, but you're probably right.
Oh, well.
What about that crash? I don't know enough about it. It's in my gray basket, maybe. There is one.
What's that?
Well, there is one you're going to be hearing a lot more about in April when the book comes out. Incident at Aztec, New Mexico. Scott and Suzanne Ramsey have done a tremendous amount of work. I used to think that was a phony story. A lot of people thought that. They did the research. It isn't a phony story. I wrote the foreword for the book because I was so impressed with the work that they did. That was in 1948, March. So there have been other crashes. I don't know what to say about Ellie or Eli or whatever. Well,
I was wondering, do you accept submissions? Like if we wrote out a manuscript or something, if we wanted you to check it out, do you accept like submissions?
Well, I might look at it. I'm not a publisher.
I mean like if we just wanted you to read it or see what you thought about our work.
Well, if it's 500 pages, no, I don't have time. Some reasonable, sure. My website, www.stantonfriedman.com, has my email address. I'll give you my email address on the air. I won't give you my phone number on the air because then we won't be able to talk on this phone line. It'll be making noises. You get a kick out of the email address. FS stands for Flying Saucer, of course. PHYS stands for Physicist. At Rogers, ROGERS.com. So write me and we'll see what we can do.
All right.
Thank you.
And anybody listening, anybody who's listening and has a piece of a saucer or knows somebody whose grandfather has a piece of a saucer, let me know.
I was going to say I've been looking a lot at the universities around here at the microfilm and of course Project Blue Book and interviewing witnesses and things. But one thing I was wondering was if I were to look at old police reports, where would I find those? Do I just go to the police station or?
It varies all over the place, but there's a new book that just came out about, what's the name? Written by Frank Soriano, Soriano, and a guy named Bouck, Bouck. And it's all about police reports of UFOs. Mm-hmm. This is police having the sightings themselves. And there's a guy in England whose name escapes me, who it's mentioned in this book, who has put together a bunch of reports from police officers over there. That's a matter of local, writing the FBI is one thing. And they have Dr. Bruce Maccabee, way back in the late 70s, used freedom of information. This is after J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI for many, many years, wrote people who asked that it's never been their job to look into UFOs. So Bruce filed a Freedom of Information Act request, got more than 1,500 pages of FBI stuff on UFOs.
Oh, dang.
They don't always tell the truth. Now, it gets a little tricky because, I'll give you a specific example. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI and with the CIA at the same time, separately. I gave them, where I was born, my full name, and told them I had a clearance and all kinds of stuff, so it'd make it easy to find a file. I wanted my file. And I get back a letter from the FBI, a quick note saying, we have checked our files and we don't have anything on you. Well, I knew it was a lie because after my security clearance was granted and renewed a couple of times, friends told me, hey, Stan, what are you up to? The FBI came calling. Okay, so I know that they're lying to me, but then I hear from the CIA. And it sends me a little squib. The only thing we have on you is a request from the FBI to see if we have anything on you. And they sent me it with a file number. So I wrote the FBI back and I said, gentlemen, here's what I got from the CIA. Can you please check your files again? Negative name check request is the technical term for this. So then I get a letter back from the FBI. We rechecked our files and found we do have a file on you. So I said, I'd like to know the size of the file and what level it's classified. They said, we have a file and it's classified. So I get back a letter saying, that information is classified too. So first they tell me they have nothing, and then they have a file, and then they can't tell me what's in the file. My file, mind you. So the system is a little weird, so to speak. And not everybody's covered by freedom of information. In other words, some states have it, not many cities have it. So you need to talk to other people who are check with MUFON, see if anybody there has been collecting citing reports from a particular area from police files. Plenty of people. The thing that varies is how they will respond when you call if you want to report a sighting. Some will take a report. Some will say, what are you drinking, lady? that kind of thing. I've had that response from people who, that's why they don't want to report it. So it just depends. There's plenty of cases out there. I mean, that's what gets me is when the debunkers try to say, well, there isn't any evidence. The SETI people try to say that. I, in my lectures, cover 5 large-scale scientific studies. After I talk about each one, I show a slide, what's it, tell them what's in it and so forth. And then I ask how many people here have read this. And typically fewer than 2% have read any of the 5. So there's a lot of data, and you certainly won't find the SETI people talking about that data. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's the first argument of the debunkers. The second is what the public doesn't know. I'm not going to tell them. The third is if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. And the fourth is do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and nobody will know the difference anyway. And you can debunk anything with those 4 rules. Of course, they're not rational. They're not scientific. They're not sensible. They're not decent. But why let that get in the way of debunking?
A question that's coming into our chat, it says, there is a new documentary out on the History Channel, apparently, and it says, there was a guy that says he used to work at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they're saying something about UFOs and alien bodies were moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they were wondering if you heard anything about that.
Well, there have been stories about there being bodies at Wright-Patterson for many, many years. As a matter of fact, when I first heard about bodies at Roswell, I was told they were carried by plane to Wright-Patterson. And when I gave a lecture in Dayton, Ohio, which is where Wright-Patterson is, I signed books at a local bookstore. I think it was Barnes & Noble. This is a number of years ago. Anyway, 7 different people came up to me quietly. One buy my book, have me sign it, and quietly told me about hearing about bodies being stored there when they worked there. There's nothing new about that idea. And the reason is that, a couple of reasons. Wright-Patterson is a very large base. 20 to 30,000 people work there most years. Secondly, it was the standard place to bring in enemy equipment, if you will, for re-examination and trying to back-engineer and all this sort of stuff. Lots of good technical people. I had a contract with them early 60s when I worked for Urja General Nucleonics, and they had great libraries, great technical people. They really knew what was going on in the world. So Wright Field would be the place to do that. Now, they wouldn't necessarily keep bodies there, but they used to have a lab for, it's sort of like monkey research, and stuff was done there on animals, smart animals. So there are plenty of classified areas. I had a clearance to do the job I was doing there, and needed an escort where I went, even though I had a clearance. So there's nothing new about the idea that indeed bodies were brought to Wright-Patterson. Let me mention one other thing. They had a major effort dealing with aviation biology. Airplanes going to fly high. What happens if you lose oxygen or you get a hole in the plane? How long does the pilot have before he conks out?
Oh, yeah.
How many G's can he stand? If you bail out of an aircraft at 42,000 feet, how quickly should you open your parachute? If you do it too quick, you're going to freeze to death.
Oh, yeah.
So aviation biology, you could fit in that little guys, little bodies, how many G's did they stand, and so forth and so on.
Well, speaking of airplanes, I was going to say, do you know anything about Project High Range, which was the X-15 spy, or the plane that could fly in space and all that?
Well, there are a number of projects. That was one where the guy jumped out of an airplane, or off a balloon, I should say, to 115,000 feet. Joseph Kittinger, I think. it was to get data on what happens at high altitude, where you can make measurements that you can't make at the surface because the air gets in the way, absorbs particles, and so forth. There are loads of past projects looking at new means of flight. One of the interesting things is that the X-15, which broke the sonic barrier, 1947, a little over 700 miles an hour. Now, everybody thought then, and it seemed to prove it, that if you want a high-speed aircraft in the atmosphere, you got to have a pointy nose, sharp wings, high melting point metals, and so forth. Our fastest craft for flight in the atmosphere is the Apollo Command Module, and gee whiz, it's a round, blunt body. In my it's kind of funny, in my book, Flying Saucers and Science, there's a picture of me with my hand on the Apollo Command Module, Apollo 12 Command Module. It's a round, blunt body. It is also true that at Wright Field, they did wind tunnel studies in the late 1947 looking at the characteristics of round, blunt bodies. Wonder if they were checking to see, hey, if these aliens are doing this, maybe we can do it too. And there's an important factor here. My mantra, if you will, is that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You got to change how you do things. A laser isn't just a better light bulb, entirely different physics. A fission propulsion system that I mentioned isn't just a better chemical rocket, entirely different physics. So you want to achieve greater ends than you're able to achieve now, you're going to have to change some of the things you do. And those who aren't willing to change are going to fall behind. No question about it.
Very true.
There's a book out called Roswell and the Reich, and the question that's being asked
Farrell.
Yeah. Do you believe that Roswell was not the Nazis, or do you think it was aliens?
Oh, no question it wasn't the Nazis, and no question it was alien. I read the book, and he ignores the testimony of the people, and he's got, here's a question you have to ask. Suppose the Germans had figured out how to build flying saucers, if you will. No question they were thinking about it, just as we were thinking about it. After all, it's pretty obvious the ideal aircraft would be one that can take off and land in a space much bigger than itself. Why do you need an 8,000-foot runway? Roswell has a 13,000-foot runway, incidentally, because for B-36s and stuff. That's a lot of space to take up, If the Germans had figured out how to successfully make a high-performance flying saucer, if you will, why didn't they use it during the war? There were, when we developed the stealth fighter, we used it, the stealth aircraft. We've used it in the war. There are a lot of wars around, and don't tell me Hitler was being a nice guy. Oh, no, we wouldn't want to spring that on those nice Americans, ridiculous. And the same with the Russians. And you want the really silly notion, combining the Germans and Roswell, is Ann Jacobson's book about Area 51. And he's got this crazy story about Dr. Death, Joseph Mengele, who did all kinds of horrible experiments on prisoners and people from the Holocaust and so forth. He did some work for Stalin, no evidence of that, but he did some work for Stalin to develop strange young beings who would be passed off as Martians and would fly in a Horton Brothers flying wing to cause panic in the United States the way, remember War of the Worlds? I don't even remember, you weren't alive, but in 1938.
Oh, you know you're talking about.
Yeah, in New Jersey. I was alive and in New Jersey at the time. I did not hear the program. Anyway, her story is that Stalin had these strange genetically modified beings who supposedly looked like Martians that would be flown in this Horton Brothers German design flying wing to crash in New Mexico, and that would cause a panic because people would think they were Martians. Now, this is truly absurd, think about it for a minute. War of the Worlds in New Jersey, people, if you believe the radio program, because it was supposedly a newscast and people depended on radio for the news, New Jersey was being invaded by Martians, and they were killing people and destroying buildings. You had every reason to panic. What could we do against Martians? We hadn't been in space at all ourselves at that time. Now, think about it for a minute. You have that happen in the most heavily populated area in the country, the New York metropolitan area, of which New Jersey is a part, of course. And instead, you have this thing crash or land or whatever in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, one of the least populated areas in the country. And that's going to cause a panic? I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
In addition, she says, right field, this wreckage was taken there, and they couldn't figure out how it worked in 4 years. Right field had collected all kinds of material about German technology. It was part of their job. As a matter of fact, they brought back literally tons of paper about German experiments, aeronautical experiments, Saved us $50 million in research. And I did work with the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson. And I'll guarantee you, if it had been a German vehicle, they'd have figured out how it worked. And then she throws in the crazy thing that there were Cyrillic letters around in a circle around this craft. That's Russian alphabet. Now, if you're trying to make people think you've got Martian technology, why would you put Russian symbols around it? Does that make any sense at all?
Not at all.
I can't imagine Stalin would believe, those Americans are so stupid they couldn't recognize Russian alphabet. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So the notion that it was... I read Farrell's book, and I even wrote a report on it. If somebody sends me an email request, I'd probably be able to dig out one of my MUFON Journal columns about Farrell and Nazis. And, there are all kinds of science fiction plots here, but how many of them are real is the question. The thing about Roswell is we've talked, most of the original witnesses are dead, of course, because it was a long time ago, but, so it's not surprising. But if you go on my website, you'll see a DVD, Recollections of Roswell. It has first-hand testimony from 27 witnesses, most of whom are deceased. So you want to hear first-hand testimony, including General Thomas Jefferson Dubose, Air Force General. Other people, Major Marcel, the intelligence officer for the only atomic bombing group in the entire world, which was the group at Roswell. And, the head of a skeptical group says 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, that, the Roswell story, the PR guy just made up the story to get attention. He didn't bother to mention that the 509th was the most elite military group in the world. They dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They exploded 2 more bombs in Operation Crossroads in the Pacific in 1946. When the guy said that, I was on the air, he was on the air, we couldn't see each other, but we could hear each other. I said, you don't even know his name, do you? Well, no. Well, I've known him for 20 years, and the notion that the PR guy for the 509th would make up a story like that is absolutely absurd. He'd have been in the brig, in 2 minutes. And he wasn't just the PR guy. He dropped the instrument package in one of those atomic bomb tests in Operation Crossroads. He was a navigator bombardier. More than 20 raids over Japan. And 10 years later, the same guy, Joe Nickel of the Committee for the Skeptical Inquiry, they need to be more skeptical about themselves. He's not a scientist. He's got 3 degrees in English. I'll give him credit for that. But 10 years later, he's saying the same thing. An anonymous PR guy put out an unauthorized press release. Total nonsense, but he repeated it because the people he was talking to wouldn't know the difference anyway. So there are a lot of stories out there, I'll tell you. Most of them are baloney.
I know, and I'm sure you've heard them all.
Well, I get asked about a lot of them, I'll say that.
So, here's another one that I'm getting asked. It says, have you ever been contacted by the Men in Black?
All I can do is tell you a funny story. I was at a conference in Oklahoma City. I was giving lectures on Saturday and Sunday. Got a call where I was staying on Saturday. Could some guys who had attended my lecture take me out to lunch on Sunday? I said, sure, why not? Told them where I was. And the next day they drive up in a big black Cadillac. And they all wore black suits. Wow. We went out, we had a nice lunch, nothing happened.
Yeah.
That's my Men in Black story. No, I have never been contacted by Men in Black. I'm not saying they're not paying attention to who's talking out there. Standard practice to pay attention. And I'm not saying I haven't talked to people. I have talked to people who have been contacted and told to keep their mouths shut. And what people forget is once you're on the inside and you have a high-level security clearance, you don't casually violate security. People say, oh, those MJ-12 guys would have told their wives, right? No, wrong. I never told my wife anything classified. Because then you're risking, you can't control what your wife says. That's the understatement of the month. But you can't keep her from talking to her friends who talk to other friends who talk to other friends. You don't give secrets to people who don't have a high-level security clearance, an appropriate level security clearance, and an appropriate need to know. Just because you got a top-secret clearance, that doesn't give you access to everything that's top secret. When I was working on nuclear airplanes, I had a Q clearance for nuclear stuff. And I'm looking in classified abstracts, and there's some reports on radiation shielding for the Navy, the classified reports. So I tried to get them. I had the right level of security clearance. I couldn't get a need to know. Admiral Rick over in the Nuclear Navy program wouldn't let people outside his program see his work. And when I was visiting Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the contract that I was on, couldn't get to see stuff that was outside my need-to-know area at all. So, it's not easy to really peel back. I had somebody call me, a young guy he and some friends were going to go to the gate at Wright-Patterson and break in and find the hangar with all the bodies in it. And I strongly advise not doing that. I said, you ever been there? No. I said, well, A, there are lots of high-level security places. B, that 25,000 people at that time working there, and there's loads of security around. Please don't try it. They didn't. But, that's terribly naive. And in my book, which one? Flying Saucers in Science, I have a chapter about keeping secrets and give some examples of expensive, extensive, high-level programs that spent tons of money in secret over a multi-year period. Anybody who doesn't think people are keeping secrets is wrong. And I'm not talking about President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky activities. There are bigger stories than that, folks.
Well, why do you think that the Men in Black contacted some of the Roswell witnesses, but they didn't contact you if you were saying some of their stories?
Well, I'm not a Roswell witness, and the people I was thinking of actually weren't Roswell witnesses that were being contacted. I think the government has real concerns about people who have current, important, classified information that they need to be told to shut up. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. Like, there are people now who are talking about disclosure. We're entitled to know everything about UFOs. Petition the White House so they'll tell us what they know. And I say, I don't think we're entitled to know everything. Why not? Because of national security. If we've learned any technical details that might be of use in building a fancy propulsion system, defense or offense, they should not be put out on the table unless the other guy's doing the same thing. I hadn't heard anybody suggest the Russians, the Chinese, and Americans get together and all put all their data out on the table. How likely is that to happen? Very unlikely, I'd say. In other words, I respect national security. I think we do need to be told that aliens are visiting, that the government has a lot of data, that we're going to hold international conferences on the psychological, economic, religious implications of alien visitations. And there are serious implications. I mean, there are still people who are saying there's no other intelligent life, Pat Robertson is one, no other intelligent life besides here on Earth. My question would be, is there intelligent life on Earth? We're spending $1 trillion this year on things military, and, 20,000 kids die every single day of preventable disease and starvation. Does that make any sense? I think there's a lot of exaggeration about Men in Black. On the other hand, we know that there have been spies who have turned over secrets. There was a guy who worked for the FBI who did. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And I'm glad people are trying to keep up with those things. I don't feel I am entitled to know everything.
This is one of my personal questions. Do you know that have you ever seen anybody that took a Geiger counter to a UFO crash site, if it does anything or not?
Well, nobody ever tells me about their sites until long afterward, but Jesse Marcel commented that there was no radiation out there. People have talked, I'm trying to think if there's a specific case where there have been a few cases where radiation has been measured, relatively low-level stuff. Now, whether that's significant or not, I don't know. As a matter of fact, at Rendlesham Forest, the Woodbridge in England back in 1980, one of the things that was surprising was that there was increased levels of radiation right near where the guys had seen something on the ground that took off, well over background. And I was there when one of the people who made the measurements talked about it. So, yeah, this wasn't, really bad levels of radiation. When a meteor comes in, it's radioactive, for example, because it's been exposed to particulate radiation, which makes some of it radioactive. Airplanes are actually, if they've been above the atmosphere for any length of time, high-flying jets, SR-71s, will come back in somewhat radioactive. Too bad.
Here's a good one. Someone's asking, does the government have any living aliens at the moment?
Well, good question. I obviously don't have an answer because I don't have a security clearance or a need to know for that information. I had it on pretty good authority that we had some aliens in captivity, if you will, originally from Roswell and from the other crashes. Whether they still have them, I have no idea. And people say, well, where could they keep them? There are huge amounts of land in the United States that you're forbidden to go on, to fly over. And I mean that seriously, and I said that one time, and a guy says, what do you mean? I'm an American, I can fly wherever I feel like. Yes, any other pilots here? You guys see aviation maps where it's marked, restricted? Oh, yes, a lot of places you can't fly, not just Area 51 in Nevada. No-fly zones. So we could hide all kinds of stuff all over the country, and there are underground bases, not just Area 51. There's a good reason. If an atomic bomb goes off, you'd just as soon be down a couple thousand feet, wouldn't you, instead of on the surface? Yeah. And secondly, the other guy spies in the sky. If you're way down, he can't tell what's going on down there. So, yes, there are underground bases. There are plenty of places you could keep aliens.
We had Frank Ficino on our show recently, and something that somebody called in and was asking him about was, do you think that they would keep the bodies at Wright-Patterson like most people think, or you think there'd probably be someplace that we don't even know about, or like Area 51 or somewhere like that?
Well, It depends. I heard enough stories about there being bodies at Wright-Patterson that I'm sure they were there at one time. It would make sense to move them also. That's hot stuff, and you want to keep it cold, if I can put it that way, rather crudely. And the reason for keeping the bodies is you would go back with new methods of analysis. We didn't have DNA techniques back in the late 40s, early 50s. We do now. The same with analyzing materials. When I started working in industry, you're talking about 0.1% in the composition of something. Then it's 0.1%, then thousands, and pretty soon it's parts per billion, because the techniques improve. And you can learn a lot once you get that greater accuracy. So it makes sense to keep them. Somebody told me he knew where those bodies were. They were right near where the old nuclear reactor used to be at Wright-Patterson. Put enough radiation signs around and nobody's going to go wandering around there. It scares the heck out of people. Oh, yeah. So it would make sense that they would be moved. And like I say, there are lots of bases around that you don't have access to. Not just Area 51 or Groom Lake or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true.
What's a good one? I know last time you were on our show, you talked about the military chasing after UFOs and trying to shoot them down. Do you know if they still do this or if they still do anything like that?
Well, that's a good question. As Frank probably told you about his book, Shoot Them Down, in 1952, there were orders issued to the military to shoot down UFOs if they don't land when instructed to do so. And General Roger Ramey, who was involved earlier in the Roswell thing, stated, it was in the papers, that we'd scrambled jets 300 times, hundreds of times. Routine, that's all. So I have personally heard of 7 stories where planes went up to chase UFOs and never came back. Frank has most of these in his book. He also talks about 200 or so fatal plane crashes between, say, 1951 and 1956, military planes. And the New York Times used words like disintegrated and disappeared. And 5 of the pilots had over 100 missions in Korea where MiGs were trying to shoot them down. It must be pretty good pilots to survive that. So what happened to them? So I think what I heard a couple of times is that the rules were changed. Take pictures, don't shoot. Pretty damn foolish thing to do if they're going to zap you before you can get your act together. We're not very nice.
Well, I know there's a story on the History Channel recently. They said that there was a Russian plane that was shot down by a UFO sometime in the 90s, I think it was. Or what was it, Tim? The 70s, 90s, something like that?
Yeah, I believe it was the 1970s. I believe it was a MiG-21 that was shot down.
Well, there was one that was shot down off Cuba that was zapped by a UFO. I was the first to hear that story. Quite intriguing. I heard it from a guy who worked for the National Security Agency at Boca Chica, nearest listening post to Cuba, and this is back in 1967. And it's dull duty. You're just listening. They're all linguists who work there, and you're listening to enemy military communications. And they're listening, and the Cuban Air Defense Command says that there's a UFO picked up on radar heading southwest at Mach 1 at 10,000 meters, a little over 30,000 feet. And so they scramble a couple of jets, and they go up after them, and the report is a spherical object without any protuberances. And they tell them, in effect, get the heck out of our airspace. No response. What should we do, the pilot asks. Shoot it down. Those decisions are made on the ground with the Russians. And so he arms his missile, he tells them. He's got his radar lock on. And then the second pilot, who's a pilot and a wingman, shrieks that the first plane had just disintegrated. And the UFO went straight up to 30,000 meters, over 90,000 feet, and headed southeast. Now, I'm talking to a guy who, with nobody else around, and he said they did their thing. They sent in the report. which is really a transcript of the conversations in English.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get told something very unusual. Send in the original report. And I asked the guy, I said, do you think they felt they could learn something about what was going on in that little bit of time? He said, I don't know, but we did as we were told. And, it makes sense that they would monitor what's going on, and when you pick up a signal indicating the other guy's got a radar lock on, you zap him. Rule number one, look out for yourself. So I don't think we're still doing that, but I don't know. I mean, after you lose a few airplanes, if I've heard 7 stories, there got to be a lot more than that, even though I get around a lot still. So, yeah, and Frank lists all the 200 fatal crashes, and that's quite a remarkable number when you think about it.
Oh, yeah.
And, I get people tell me, well, Stan, of course they told the families what went on. No, they wouldn't. There's a book, By Any Means Necessary, by William Burroughs, who talks about 166 military crew members of reconnaissance planes that after the war were tickling the radar systems, that's the fancy term that's used, in North Korea, Russia, and China, right after the war. They'd head straight in and see how quickly the local guys got a lock on, whether they could foul up the radar, with chaff or whatever. And these planes got shot down. They have big crews. It's at least 10 airplanes. And the families were told nothing, except that unfortunate accident happened at sea. No bodies. Sorry about that. 2001. A conference was called. They brought in the families. They gave them the medals their brothers, sons, fathers, whatever had earned, and they told them what happened to them. So from, say, 46 to 2001, they had heard nothing. So, of course, they'll lie about it. Incidentally, we shot down some Russian planes, too. Didn't tell anybody about that either. Secrecy is a way of life.
While we're on the subject, I was going to say, we're doing our Ely UFO crash stuff I was telling you about. And we talked to a man who said in the 1970s there was a UFO that they were tracking that was originally spotted in Wyoming. And apparently they said it did like a fish hook type maneuver, but came around over by Reno. And they said that airplanes supposedly chased after that or were trying to shoot that down, apparently, is what the guy was saying.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. In other words, it depends what the other guy is doing. If he's someplace he shouldn't be, like over a secret facility, you might tell him, get the heck out of our airspace or we'll go after you. We have a right to do that. I'll release this dog if you come on my property. It's that kind of thing. Yeah. So I don't know.
Another question. It says, how long were the aliens from Roswell alive before they died?
We don't know. We don't have any of the classified reports from that. Supposedly, at least one lived a few years. And there was a guy at Los Alamos, maybe, who his job it was to communicate with them. We don't have any official records like that at all. People say, what was the ship made of? How am I supposed to know? You're not sending me reports. I wish they did.
Here's a good one. I know you had a good time with this one last time you were on. Dulce, New Mexico. I'm trying to remember the guy's name, but they're asking me to ask you about there's some guy who says he's missing an arm or something from fighting aliens at Dulce, New Mexico base or something like that, is what they're saying.
I've heard a lot of stories about Dulce, and I haven't yet been able to verify anything. I've talked to guys who spent time in the area, who have talked to the natives in the area. It is native land, some of it. And there are some underground bases that might have been used for storage for nuclear weapons, stuff like that. But beyond that, who knows? That's the trouble with those stories. I mean, the thing about Roswell is I got a whole bunch of people that we talked to, including people like General Dubose and Major Marcel and Lieutenant Hout, and and we also have the contemporary newspaper coverage. These other stories, you start trying to find somebody who'll give you sworn testimony, and it's pretty hard to find. And, even if a guy says he was there, sometimes you go and check their DD-214 form, the discharge papers, and it doesn't check out. There are a lot of people who lie. There's no law against lying. I shouldn't say that on the air. But, so a lot of stories, but you need evidence. And most people don't want to chase after evidence. And you also need a big gray basket, as I call it. Not enough data. Not black, not white, it's gray. And I don't mean little gray guys either. That may be the case too. But, sometimes you have to say we don't know enough. Because I can't prove something is impossible doesn't mean it happened.
I don't know if you're familiar with the areas outside of Vegas, like in this general area, but I have some coworkers that are asking me if you know anything about a government base, like an old government base that was in the Pahrump or Blue Diamond, Nevada area.
Even before Art Bell moved there?
I don't know. That's just some of my coworkers are asking me to ask you that.
No, I don't know of anything out there. On the other hand, I do know that there's the nuclear test site out there. When I was working on nuclear rockets, we ran tests out not far from Jackass Flats, Nevada, which is in that general area. And it's a big base. I was there when I was working for Westinghouse. I ran experiments out there. And there's a lot of structures and so forth, and highly classified work. And it's got a fence and it's guarded and all the rest of that. And so, who knows what went on out there? These places were chosen because they were isolated. It's just like White Sands Missile Range. If you're going to test rockets, which sometimes go where you don't want them to go, you got to pick a place where if they go astray, they're not killing anybody. White Sands Missile Range was the largest base in the United States because they needed a lot of room to test those rockets. It's kind of like I will be on April the 6th, I think it is. I will be with a tour of the Southwest. It's listed on my website. And Trinity site, where the first nuclear weapon was exploded, is open 2 days a year. I've been there once before. It's on the grounds of the White Sands Missile Range. And I will be with a group of people. I will be there this year on April 7th, I guess it is, a Saturday, I think. And there's a lot of nothing out there. There'll be a lot of people there that day, one of 2 days a year when you can go there. But there's loads of land where all kinds of crazy stuff goes on. And you don't wander in and say, hey, I'd like to see what's secret here.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of your lecture, is that the only one that you have planned at the moment?
Oh, no. As a matter of fact, I've got to add to my website. I'm going to be speaking. I'll be on that trip. I'll be talking to those people. I just booked a talk in Mandan, North Dakota, right across the street from Bismarck, on May the 6th. I'll be speaking in Sacramento June the 15th, 16th, 17th. I'll be speaking in Toronto. Coast to Coast is having a conference where there'll be two of us, Mr. Cremo and myself, and George Norrie will be there. That's on the 24th of June, I guess. No, 23rd. And in July, I'll be speaking at in Roswell, 3 lectures, the annual festival, if you will, June 28th, 29th, 30th, and July 1st and 2nd. there'll be a whole bunch of speakers, and we'll be signing books, and and there'll be a parade and all kinds of good stuff going on in Roswell. And then the MUFON conference this year, MUFON has moved its headquarters, that's Mutual UFO Network, from Colorado to Cincinnati, and I'll be speaking there. That's the first week in August, and I'm sure there'll be a few more coming up. I'm no plans to be back in Saudi Arabia, though. That was kind of fun. But it was in January. It was a lot warmer there than here.
I said, do you come to Vegas that often to do lectures, or not really?
Not that often. I've spoken there. I've spoken at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. There's a community college there I've spoken at. I spoke to the local section of the American Nuclear Society. Wherever. Most of my geography about the country is based on where I've spoken. Hey, I'm an old guy. I'm not seeking lots of talks. I'm available. But as long as I'm healthy, I'll go where people want me. But, I wrote several books, so I was busy with that stuff. And, I'll turn 80 in 2014. And I hope I'm still around. But so far, so good.
Sure you will.
Well, my parents both lived to be 90, so I'm an optimist, you understand.
Yeah, that's good though. Yeah, because as long as I've ever been alive, I remember mid-90s when I was, still old enough to understand what's going on. Just becoming old enough to understand UFOs and everything. Like, they've always been one of my favorite researchers of all time, so.
Well, good. Well, I've been at it a long time. Let's face it, I've been at it a long time, and I'm playing to my long suit. I worked in advanced technology. I worked under security. I love talking to people. I found that I was lucky enough to have a very good memory, so that if they asked me a question, I could give them an answer instead of, well, I'll get back to you tomorrow about that,
Yeah.
Not as sharp as I used to be, but still pretty good.
We have about 7 minutes left in the show, so I have a couple quick questions.
Okay.
Last time we talked to you, you said that you were working on some memoirs, or were thinking about working on some memoirs.
Well, yeah, part of this deal on the Magic Men, which would be the book made from Top Secret Magic and about MJ-12 and Don Schmidt and his activities and so forth. Part of that is they were talking about doing a memoir as well, and why not? And I've thought about it. I haven't really written anything about it, but, I guess I'm old enough to where some people can say, well, you ought to have a memoir by now, Stan. That's probably true. So there are bits and pieces in my books, Top Secret Magic, Flying Saucers and Science, Captured, Crash at Corona, and the latest book, actually, is in 2010, Science Was Wrong. And, I hate to tell your listeners, but every so often a very smart scientist says something very stupid that gets in the way of progress. So there are 14 chapters in that book by myself and Kathleen Martin. We did Captured together. We each did 7 of them, and boy, it's time for a second book, really, because smart scientists continue to say stupid things. The top astronomer in the United States in October 1903 published a paper in which he said men would never fly any distance in a vehicle. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. The British astronomer Royal, in less than 2 years before Sputnik, said space travel is utter bilge. What can I say? There are all kinds of examples of this. And the trouble is that they stand in the way of progress. When some big shot has spoken, well, we're not going to spend any money to support that because Dr. So-and-so says it's ridiculous. And you learn something by studying examples of smart people saying stupid things.
Here's a good one. Do you believe in other paranormal studies, or like ghosts or Bigfoot or things like that?
I think you have to take each one, just like each UFO sighting or each UFO story, on its own merits. I am interested in, we talk about paranormal phenomena in science was wrong. There's a lot of work indicating that things like mental telepathy and similar stuff work. Not 100%, but look, some of your best antibiotics don't work for everybody. That doesn't mean they're of no use. It means it's not 100%. So it's the same with some people who have very special skills. And there's a chapter in Science Was Wrong about paranormal, for want of a better word, stuff. And so believe in it. You know, I'm not a believer in anything. Chocolate tastes better than vanilla. I'm a believer in that, you know, opinion stuff. But in terms of evaluating the legitimacy of stuff, you got to look at evidence. And sometimes you have to say, not enough data, I don't know.
We have a few minutes left in the show. I was going to end on the note saying, is there anything else that you would like to tell our listeners, like any upcoming books or lectures, or if you wanted to talk a little bit more about your contract, your movie deal that you were talking about, or anything like that?
Well, I'm hoping the movies will go Magic Men, MAJIC, and I think that we're talking about changing the name of the book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, to Betty and Barney. I don't know, but if these get made, I think they will have a real impact. So I'm really hoping they'll get made. But Hollywood is totally unpredictable, at least by me. Now, I do want to say that I sense a change in attitude because the Kepler space satellite makes it appear now, on the basis of the measurements they've made so far, that our solar system might have as many as our galaxy, the Milky Way, might have as many as 100 billion planets in it. And it wasn't too long ago that Frank Drake of the SETI people was saying there might be as many as 8,000. So now people are thinking, you know what? We can't possibly be the only ones. We didn't know there were any other planets out there. Now we're talking 100 billion. And it's not to say that all of them have civilizations on them. Let's suppose it's only 10%. That's only 10 billion out there. And anybody who thinks we're the most advanced has got a screw loose somewhere.
Definitely.
We've only had fancy technology for a couple hundred years. And unless you think the world was created in 4004 BC, as Bishop Ussher said, so 6,000 years ago, we don't know a lot about what's happened in the past, even on our own planet, no less out there everywhere. And as I said earlier, just 39 light years away, there are two sun-like stars that are 1 billion years older than the sun. 1 billion years. I'm impressed with that.
Oh, yeah.
So, well, we have about a minute and a half left on the show. I'd like to thank you again for coming back on the show, Stanton.
Yeah,
my pleasure. You. And I would refer
we'll have to
people
do it again
to my
sometime soon.
Okay, well, check my website. There are a lot of articles on it too, not just a list of books and stuff. www.stantonfriedman.com. And if you want to be intrigued by something, look at the review of the MJ-12 situation. You got a lot of guys out there saying it's nonsense. I say there are 3 genuine documents and the most important classified documents ever released to the public. There's a puzzle for you, folks.
Alrighty. But thanks again, Stanton.
I'd
like to thank our listeners for asking questions and tuning in. And like I said, if you want to hear more updates on Stanton Friedman, you could go to www.stantonfriedman.com. And, I guess I'll have to say have a good night, Stanton. Hope you had fun.
I did.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Right,
Bye-bye.
Bye.